Bien, bonjour à toutes et bonjour à tous. Good morning, everyone. Reimagining punishment, the phrase could not be more appropriate and more timely for a French audience, as month after month, new historical records of prison populations are established in France. 9 in the past year, with an acceleration in the expansion of the carceral demographics. It took 9 months to go from 72,000 to 73,000 inmates. 4 months to go from 74,000 to 75,000. And 2 months recently from 76,000 to 77,000. An evolution all the more spectacular since, as is the case in most countries, it has no statistical correlation with the evolution of crime. In fact, crime continues to decline while incarceration pursues its inflationary pace. This is what made me describe the present time as a punitive moment that is a sort of signature of the contemporary politics of punishment. France has today the most numerous prison population of its history in peace times. Of course, neither is this moment a novelty, nor is it unique to the French case. Indeed, since the 1970s, most Western countries and many countries elsewhere have gone through a similar evolution, the most dramatic being that of the United States, where the carceral demographics has been multiplied by 7 in 3 decades to reach more than 2 million people in prison, with an overrepresentation of ethno-racial minorities, especially black people, the combination of the two phenomena corresponding to what David Garland coined as mass imprisonment. Albeit to a lesser degree, a similar trend has been observed in Europe, with 2 exceptions: Eastern Europe, where a significant decrease has been noted, but with extremely high prison rates as starting points inherited from the communist regimes, and Scandinavian countries, where political traditions of social welfare and important mobilizations for penal and penitentiary reforms have avoided the punitive turn occurring on the rest of the continent. Yet, in recent years, the tendency has progressively and slowly reversed, as we will hear a little later. While the reasons of this evolution are multiple, complex, and not perfectly identified, there has been a decline in the carceral demographics, sometimes in a spectacular way, most of the time in a quite modest manner. There is only one country in the Western world where this evolution has not been observed. It is France, where records continue to be established monthly, where the government and the legislator constantly announce measures and laws to include new offenses involving prison sentences, to impose longer time to be done for various violations of the law, and to request prosecutors and judges more severity. These offenses, violations, and severity concern only low-income classes, ethno-racial minorities, the project youth, as white-collar criminality is increasingly spared. Judges always finding options to give suspended sentences and sentencing arrangement to corrupt politicians and economic offenders, so that even when they are sentenced to prison, they are not incarcerated. Even if the absolute numbers are much lower, the overrepresentation of black and Arab men in French prison is comparable to that of black and Latino men in US prisons. The consequence of this situation is dire. In French maisons d'arrêt, short-stay prisons, the equivalent of US jails, where half of the inmates are awaiting trial therefore innocent until proven guilty, and the other half are sentenced to less than 2 years, meaning for petty crime. Most are 2 or 3 in a 9 square meter cell, supposed to be for one person. The number of mattresses on the floor has increased by 50% in the past year. Under these conditions, inmates in pre-trial or with short prison term are confined there 22 hours per day with 3 square meters for each of them. This is a form of solitary confinement made worse because of the cohabitation with 2 other men with different lifestyles, habits, and characters, which makes life in prison unlivable. In this context, reimagining punishment, as we will try to do today, is of crucial import, since the current failure of French authorities to address the critical situation of prisons is not only due to a lack of democratic sense of justice and fairness. It is, of course, but it is also the consequence of a lack of imagination. Hence, the idea of bringing scholars from other parts of the world, Europe and North America, to reflect on the situation elsewhere, on efforts to reform the system, on successes, failures, and unintended consequences. The speakers might somewhat be less optimistic than I was when I invited them, but as social scientists, we value knowledge over fantasy. What is important is to be able to imagine. My conception of the social sciences is that by studying different worlds and at different times, we can wonder that, as Michel Foucault wrote in What is Enlightenment, in what is given to us as universal, necessary, obligatory, what place is occupied by whatever is singular, contingent, and the product of arbitrary constraints. In other words, if things have been different in the past or are different elsewhere, we can imagine that they do not have to be what they are. My course at the Collège de France this year had for title The Faculty to Punish, La Faculté de Punir. It not only analyzed the mechanism and reasons of the punitive moment we have been and in France still are going through. It also questioned the very idea of punishment, showing that our societies punish far beyond the legal definition of what it is to be punished. Presumably, innocent people are punished. Undocumented migrants who can be asylum seekers are detained. The police unlawfully punish. So do the military. Extrajudiciary retribution and indefinite detention without charges exist in many countries. And today, as I speak, a collective punishment and indiscriminate retribution are being inflicted in Gaza to men, women, children, and babies, Palestinian civilians, by the Israeli army, and by proxy by Western countries. My last lecture this year was titled Realistic Utopias. It reminded that utopia are not, as readers of Thomas More would have it, an ideal and impossible place, or literally a non-place, but as Paul Ricoeur wrote, the imaginary project of another society, another reality, another world. What interested me was that certain ideas, which at a certain point in history seemed to be impracticable, later became facts. I took the example of the abolition of death penalty, which was first proposed to the French Parliament in 1791 and became law 190 years later in 1981. The morning session today will present a few European inspiring experiences and experiments. It will be chaired by Samantha Besson, professor at the Collège de France on the chair Droit international des institutions. It will be introduced with a general presentation of the major trends in Europe by Professor José Ángel Brandariz from the law school at the Universidad da Coruña, who wonders whether we are witnessing an emerging time of penal moderation in Europe. Then Professor Tapio Lapis-Epela from the Institute of Criminology and Penal Policy at the University of Helsinki will discuss the Finnish case, which is unique as the incarceration rate in that country was divided by 3 at the very time when most European countries were engaged in their punitive turn. Finally, Professor Miranda Bohn from the Department of Criminal Law and Criminology at Leiden University will approach the Dutch case, which is also of major interest as the Netherlands recently had the most dramatic decrease in its carceral demographics, to the point that it has begun to rent its emptied cells to Belgium to imprison its convicts. Interestingly, the evolution in Finland occurred under a left-wing government, and that in the Netherlands happened under a right-wing government, which can also be a source of reflection, although both countries have recently been under the influence of nationalist and populist parties, as has happened in various parts in Europe. The afternoon session will address some of the challenges facing the United States, whose correctional institutions host more than 1 out of 5 inmates in the world. It will be chaired by Jean-Marie Delarue, who was, among other important positions in the French public administration, contrôleur général des lieux de privation de liberté, that is the ombudsman for prisons and other sites of confinement, and who, being the first to occupy this position, defined the role and perimeter of an institution doing evaluation and making recommendation to the government. The session will be opened by Professor Judith Resnick, a legal scholar in the law school at Yale University, who has done an important historical work on punishment, especially on what is permissible and impermissible. Then Professor Reuben Jonathan Miller, a sociologist from the School of Social Work at Chicago University, or the University of Chicago, who has conducted ethnographic research on prisons and on the difficult afterlife of incarceration, will discuss his most recent project and envisage, as he says, a new world. Finally, Professor Jocelyn Simonson, a lawyer who previously worked as a public defender and currently teaches at the Brooklyn Law School, will present examples of collective resistance of individuals and groups who try to transform the criminal justice system to make it less maybe criminal and more just. Each presentation will be about 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and there will remain 15, 20 minutes for the discussion at the table and with the public. The presenters will speak in English and will show slides to help everyone to follow their talk. There will be a final discussion at the end of the day with all of you, which I will introduce. So I'm very grateful to all the participants in the 2 panels and the 2 chairs of the sessions for being with us today, and also, of course, to all of you for attending this event. I also want to thank Patricia Foti for preparing your visit, and of course, the staff of the Collège de France working today with us. So now, at least for one day, let us reimagine punishment. Thank you.